If you spend $500 on a watch today, you can get something that is extremely accurate, durable, water resistant, made from interesting materials, and it will last you for decades. You spend $5,000 and you can get a genuinely sophisticated mechanical watch with an in-house movement, serious finishing, excellent construction, and chronometer level performance. Now, if you spend $15,000, you can start getting into some very traditional forms of high-end watchmaking. And when you go up beyond 30, 40,000 or more, you can get watches where movements are finished by hand, components are produced in tiny quantities, and an enormous amount of skilled labor goes into actually creating something that might perform worse functionally than the $500 watch that we started with. So where exactly does all that extra money go? And more importantly, which watch brands actually give you the most for your money at each of those price points? Because when I first started thinking about this video, I thought that I knew most of those answers. You'd have something like Citizen at the affordable end, you'd have maybe Tudor in the middle, and then Jaeger-LeCoultre and Vacheron and Lange Söhne as we start climbing that ladder into high horology. But once I actually started looking at what you're receiving for the money, some of those answers change, including one brand that I personally own and love and probably would have expected to make this list, but it didn't. So in this video, we're gonna work our way from a few $100s all the way into watches costing tens of thousands of dollars or more and ask the same question at every step of the way. What did spending more money actually get us? Because I think that's the more useful way to talk about value when it comes to watches. Now, before we name any brands, we need to establish something that's going to be important for the conversation. Now, when I say value, I don't mean inexpensive. And I also don't mean the watch with the most specifications listed on the product page. Value for the purpose of this video is going to be how effectively does a manufacturer turn the money you're paying into the tangible substance in the watch itself. So that could mean movement engineering, materials, case and bracelet construction, accuracy, or plenty of other aspects of the watchmaking. It could be the amount of specialized labor required to make the thing. And what I'm intentionally going to give very little weight to in this video, once again, is prestige. And I'm also not really interested in resale value here. You know, those are real considerations when people buy watches, but it's a different question than what we're looking at in this video. If one watch costs twice as much as another because the logo on the dial commands a premium, you know, that may matter to the market, but it doesn't necessarily mean twice as much money went into making the watch itself. And that's the distinction that I want to understand in this video. Now, there's another important caveat here, and this does not mean that whichever brand wins at a particular price point is automatically the brand or the watch that you should buy, because your preferences still matter. I've talked about core preferences before. You know, a watch can provide incredible value and still be completely wrong for you as a collector. So today, what we're trying to determine is simply this. At a given price, who makes the strongest case that you can actually see where your money went? And the answer gets much more complicated as the prices go up. So let's start at the low end of things, because before we can understand what, say, a $5,000 watch gives us, we need to appreciate how much watch today you can get for just a few $100s. And I think Citizen might be the best example here. Now, Seiko was the first obvious alternative, and there's a very strong case for Seiko as well. You know, they have enormous vertical integration, a huge mechanical watch catalog, decades of history, and they can give you legitimate mechanical watchmaking for surprisingly little money. But ultimately, I chose Citizen because Citizen demonstrates something that I think is important at the very beginning of our exercise today. Watchmaking value doesn't have to mean mechanical complexity. You know, for a few $100s, Citizen can give you EcoDrive solar technology that essentially removes battery changes from normal ownership of a quartz watch. They use titanium extensively at price points where it's very uncommon to see. They make really accurate quartz movements, they make capable dive watches, and they do most of it in-house. So when you look at something relatively straightforward like a Siyosa, you're talking about an automatic watch with a sapphire crystal, an integrated bracelet styling for several $100s. Now, is the finishing comparable to what we're going to see later in this list? Of course not. Is the movement something you're going to spend 20 minutes staring at through a loop? Probably not. But that's not really the point. The point is that our baseline is already incredibly high here. For somewhere around $500, we can get a watch that can be accurate, durable, reliable, technologically sophisticated, and capable of serving its owner for an extremely long time. Which means that every additional dollar we spend from this point forward now has to justify itself. So that kind of brings us to roughly that $1,000 price point. And this is an interesting one because it's where you start getting something that very convincingly feels like a Swiss mechanical luxury watch without really entering luxury watch pricing. And the obvious example here is Tissot. So take something like the PRX Powermatic 80. For under or around $1,000, depending on the version, you're getting a Swiss automatic movement with roughly 80 hours of power reserve, a sapphire crystal, a very well executed integrated bracelet design, and a watch that feels considerably more expensive than the Citizen that we just talked about. And here's where we can see the first significant jump. So the Citizen was all about capability. Tissot starts giving us more mechanical interest and refinement. We're beginning to spend money on things that aren't necessarily improving the watch's functionality, and that's what luxury really is. The automatic movement is arguably less accurate than a quartz Citizen, requires more maintenance, it's mechanically more vulnerable, and yet we're willing to pay more for it because now we're valuing the architecture and experience of mechanical watchmaking itself. And that's important because already, only one step into this ladder that we're climbing today, value is beginning to become something other than just pure functionality. But the really interesting jump happens around $2,000. Now, when I started planning this video, this was Longines without hesitation. And there's a very good reason for that. Longines gives you an extremely complete product around this price range. If you take a watch like the Conquest, that'll give you a modern automatic movement with a long power reserve, a silicone balance spring, good water resistance, excellent case construction. You got a proper bracelet on it, a full sapphire crystal, and the fit and finish you would kind of expect from a serious Swiss manufacturer. If someone came to me with $2,000 or $2,500 and said, hey, I want one good Swiss watch that I can wear all the time, Longines would be very high on that list. But that isn't exactly the question that we're asking today. What we're asking is, where can I most clearly see what my money is buying me? And I gotta be honest, once I framed it that way, Nomos became much harder to ignore because for roughly this amount of money, Nomos can give you a genuine manufacturer movement that's produced in Glashütte. So something like a Club Campus gives you a manually wound movement that's extremely thin, visually distinctive, built within the company, and placed inside a watch that's still practical enough to offer real water resistance and everyday wearability. And that changes our comparison. Longines arguably gives you the more complete luxury product in this conversation. It's got automatic winding, a strong everyday usability, a bracelet, very polished industrial execution. But Nomos gives you a surprisingly concentrated amount of watchmaking. At only around $2,000, you're already getting that type of in-house movement architecture that not long ago was something collectors would associate with much higher price points. And this is our first really important lesson of the day. The watch that provides the most value is not necessarily the one with the longest list of features, but sometimes the value is in getting access to something that's genuinely difficult or expensive to manufacture earlier than you would expect. So Longines remains an excellent proposition, but under the framework we're using here, I think Nomos actually makes the stronger case. So from here, let's roughly double the price once again. At this level, the comparison gets more difficult because Oris makes an extremely compelling argument. Particularly if you look at something like the Caliber 400, you're getting roughly 5 days of power reserve. You have strong anti-magnetic properties, long recommended service intervals with a very long warranty of 10 years. And you're getting all that from an independent Swiss company in watches that are typically very well built and usable. Now, if we're looking purely at the movement spec sheet, Oris is extremely difficult to just dismiss. And that kind of raises the question of why is everyone so focused then on Tudor? Because this is where I think we need to evaluate the entire watch. So with something like the Black Bay 58, Tudor is giving you robust manufacturer movement architecture. They give you chronometer, or in newer executions, actually master chronometer level certification. You've got serious magnetic resistance, excellent water resistance, strong bracelet construction, great clasps, and just an overall level of industrial execution that's extremely consistent across the catalog. And that's where Tudor wins this particular comparison for me. Not because the movement necessarily destroys Oris on specs, it really doesn't, but because at around $5,000, Tudor gives you an unusually complete package: case, movement, bracelet, clasp, certifications, durability, and finishing. Everything feels like it belongs at the same level. And that's another lesson I think is worth taking from this exercise. Value isn't created by one spectacular component surrounded by an average watch. The whole product really matters here. At this point now, we've gone from Citizen giving us tremendous functionality, to Tissot giving us accessible Swiss mechanical watchmaking, to Nomos giving us true manufacturer movement architecture, and then to Tudor giving us a very complete luxury level product. And now we hit the point where things become much more interesting, because somewhere around $6,000 to $8,000, I actually don't think there's one clear winner here. I think there are two. And this is where the entire idea of value starts changing, because Omega and Grand Seiko both give you a remarkable amount for this kind of money. However, they spend that money very differently. So let's start with Omega. Take an Aquaterra. Y'all know I love me the Aquaterra. I own one. I'm wearing it today, and it's fantastic. So you're getting a coaxial escapement, a master chronometer movement, METAS certification. You have very strong magnetic resistance, excellent accuracy standards, 150 meters of water resistance, sophisticated case construction with the beveling, and high-quality dials. The machining is second to none. The bracelets are very capable, and an enormous amount of engineering behind both the movement and the manufacturing processes are required to build one. Now, Omega is one of the strongest examples of the advantage that scale can give a luxury watch buyer. They produce enough watches to invest pretty heavily in technology, into movement development, into materials and testing, while spreading those costs across meaningful production volume. So when you buy an Omega, a surprising amount of money is still going to the things that materially affect the watch. Things like performance, testing, movement construction, materials, and durability. And that makes Omega an extraordinary value proposition at this level. But then you have Grand Seiko that comes along and they spend their money a little bit differently. Now, we're talking roughly similar prices here. Again, $6,000 to $8,000. Grand Seiko can deliver you a spring drive watch, which is already one of the most technically distinctive movement systems available anywhere in mechanical watchmaking. You can get extraordinarily precise case polishing, highly developed dial manufacturing, very sharp hands and indices, and interesting textures. Now, the movement finishing is often considerably more visually expressive than what you would find in other watches at a similar price point. And then you also have an overall level of craft that's difficult to find elsewhere without spending considerably more money. So, which one gives you more for your money? I actually don't think that's the right question anymore. So the question kind of turns into more of what are you actually getting? If you value engineering and testing and robustness and technical performance, well then, yeah, of course, Omega makes an extraordinary argument here. But if you value things like dial work and surface finishing and visual execution and an unusual form of movement technology, Grand Seiko makes for a really great argument. And I think that this is the point in our price curve where value stops being predominantly objective, because both companies can very clearly show you where your money went, but they're simply spending it on different things. And once you understand that, the next step becomes even more interesting, because now we're going to have some fun and we're going to spend almost twice as much. So when I got to the price range of, let's say, $12,000 to $14,000, this was probably the most surprising result for me personally. Because if you had asked me before doing this exercise which brand represented great traditional watchmaking, somewhere in, again, that $10,000, maybe $15,000 range, I would probably have said Jaeger-LeCoultre with no question. And obviously I hold JLC in very high regard. I love my perpetual enamel. You know, they have enormous movement manufacturing capabilities, a tremendous history of caliber development, complications, ultra-thin movements, and really good finishing. And watches like, let's say, the Master Ultra-Thin Moon demonstrate just how much mechanical sophistication can be packaged into a very thin and elegant watch. So I kind of assumed that JLC would comfortably occupy this spot. Then I looked more closely at Chopard's LUC collection, and specifically something like the LUC XPS. Now, at roughly the same general level as the Master Ultra-Thin Moon, you're looking at a watch that's only a little over 7 millimeters thick. Inside is an automatic manufacture caliber only a little over 3 millimeters thick. It uses a micro rotor that's made from gold. You have stacked barrels providing a super strong power reserve. You have COSC certification, and you have a movement architecture that visually and technically starts to look much more like what we would traditionally associate with super high-end watchmaking. And that's when I had to separate two questions and be really objective here. The one question was, which watch would I personally prefer? And the other was, which watch makes the stronger value argument under the framework of this video? Those don't have to produce the same answer, and they won't, because JLC may give you more complication in the Master Ultra-Thin Moon. I think it's arguably the more recognized manufacturer, and depending on your design preferences, you may like the design much more, and I certainly do. But if we're strictly asking where the money went in this watch, Chopard gives us an extraordinary amount of sophisticated movement architecture and finishing at this level. So I think Chopard LUC actually wins at this price point. And I say that as someone who owns and loves a Jaeger-LeCoultre. That doesn't suddenly make JLC a bad value, far from it, but it simply demonstrates something that becomes increasingly important from this point forward in the conversation, and that is that great value and personal preferences are not the same thing. Now we start to climb into truly serious money here when we take the next jump. Now, when we get to the $20,000 to $30,000 range, my original instinct here was Vacheron Constantin. And that's not difficult to defend by any means. You know, a watch like the Overseas gives you excellent movement finishing, Geneva Steel standards, a highly sophisticated case and bracelet, and one of the great historic manufacturers in watchmaking. It is truly an exceptional product. But once again, I forced myself to strip away something that's difficult to ignore at this price, and that is the name on the dial. Because Vacheron is one of the most prestigious brands in the world, and that prestige has real economic value. But we're intentionally trying not to give it much weight here. So if we're asking where we can see an unusually high concentration of expensive to produce watchmaking at this level and this price point, I think Parmigiani Fleurier may make the stronger case. So if you take something like the Tonda PF micro rotor, you can get a very thin integrated bracelet sports watch with a guilloche dial. You've got a manufacturer micro rotor movement that's only a few millimeters thick. very high-end case finishing. There's even platinum elements in certain references. A very restrained design. I love hearing some of the conversations with Parmigiani's new CEO, and a level of production that is nowhere near the volume of larger manufacturers. And at this point, money is no longer primarily buying you better specs. We've kind of passed that long time ago. Nobody buys a Parmigiani because they needed a more accurate way to tell the time. What you're increasingly buying here is craft. You're buying the process, the actual construction of the movement, the finishing, the dial work and design. And this is where diminishing returns become almost impossible to ignore. Because is a $25,000 Parmigiani 5 times better than a $5,000 Tudor? Absolutely not. It's not how it works. The improvement here is not linear. Instead, you're paying exponentially more money now for increasingly small but difficult to produce differences. And that brings us to the extreme end of the spectrum here. So at this point, we have to ask the obvious question. Can a watch costing tens of thousands of dollars possibly represent good value compared to our Citizen? No, not if value means functionality. Now, the Citizen might be more accurate, maybe require less maintenance or more resistant to abuse, and it may actually perform the basic job of being a watch better. But that's no longer what we're buying here. So, A Lange Söhne makes this distinction incredibly obvious, because when you look at a Lange movement, the movement itself is one of the primary products. Individual components are finished using multiple techniques, edges are beveled and polished, balance bridges are hand engraved, movements are assembled, they're taken apart, cleaned, and then assembled again. Movement architecture is frequently developed here in ways that are mechanically interesting, even when a simpler solution could have done the job. And all of that requires highly trained people working for a significant amount of time on each watch. That is expensive. And unlike brand prestige, that expense is something that we can directly connect back to the physical product on the wrist. This is where the labor becomes one of the biggest things you're paying for. It's not just the engineering or manufacturing of equipment, it's literally human time and skill that it takes to make these watches. So yes, I think a Lange can represent good value, but only after we acknowledge that we're now using the word value in a completely different way than we were with Citizen. And that's really the answer to the question that we started with. So where do diminishing returns actually begin? The answer is almost immediately. The moment you go from an inexpensive quartz watch to a mechanical watch, you've probably already accepted worse functionality in exchange for something that you find more interesting. But that doesn't mean that spending more stops giving you something. It just means that what you're buying keeps changing. So again, at just a few $100s, Citizen gives you remarkable function and technology in a watch. Then when you go to $1,000, Tissot gives you accessible Swiss mechanical watchmaking. When you get to $2,000, Nomos gives you surprisingly serious manufacture movement construction. At $5,000, Tudor gives you an extremely complete industrial luxury product. Then around $6,000 to $8,000, Omega and Grand Seiko show us two different ways of spending money: engineering versus craft. Then around $13,000, Chopard starts giving us a genuine high-end movement architecture. And then when you get to $25,000, Parmigiani gives us the kind of craft, the thinness, the traditional production techniques that become dramatically more expensive to execute. And at the very top, Lange shows us what happens when skilled labor itself becomes a major component of the product. So there isn't one point where spending more money suddenly stops making sense. There's only a point where the additional money starts buying you very different things. And that's why I don't think the useful question here is what's the best value watch, but it's more like what exactly am I paying for, and do I actually care about that? Because if all you care about is accuracy and a reliable and durable watch, you can stop really early on this list. You don't need a luxury watch. And that's ultimately why I think value has to be personal, not subjective, but personal. And not because we shouldn't critically evaluate what manufacturers charge, we absolutely should, but because a good purchase isn't simply the watch that gives you the largest quantity of watchmaking per dollar. It's really the watch where the things you are paying extra for are the same things that you actually value. And if you understand that before you buy the watch, you're much less likely to spend thousands or even tens of thousands on qualities or core preferences, as I call them, that ultimately don't matter very much to you. And that's a much better definition of getting your money's worth. So what do you think? At what price point do you think that watches stop giving you enough additional value to justify spending more? And what are you actually willing to pay more for? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video today, please do like it and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.